Welcome, students. Thank you for logging in to do your brief homework assignment. Hopefully you feel that you learned a lot about the skull and the skeleton in class today. This is going to be a quick recap to make sure that your notes are 100% correct and complete. You can check your skull labeling, so I highly recommend if you don't have your blue handouts, go ahead and grab your 2 blue handouts, the one that has the skeleton on it, including the vertebrae and the ribs, and the other handout that has the skulls, because as we go through, it's going to be important that you take a moment and check your work also. Okay, so to start, on the first blue handout, you have this bone list. And after today, all of these are labeled or should be labeled, so make sure they are as you go through this quick tutorial. These are the bones we will need to know this chapter. Okay, so some classes have done this already, and some students or some classes will need to do this. So please, at this time, find your blue handout that has the skeleton on it. Okay? It looks like so. Here we go. This one. So you want to look at this skeleton, and in the end, we're going to have this labeled with the axial and appendicular skeleton will be labeled red or blue. Okay, so go ahead and find that handout. And then you'll want to take a moment and read this slide. Okay, so you can pause the video, but you're going to read about these 2 categories of bones within the skeleton. We have the axial skeleton and appendicular. Okay, so take a moment, pause the video, and go ahead and read this short reading on this slide. Okay, so if you're still listening, hopefully you finished reading. At this point, we're going to label the bones on that blue handout, on that skeleton sheet, okay? And you want to add this description in as well. So go ahead on your sheet and in blue, see how here it has axial in blue. In blue, write axial skeleton, and then I would write this down about it. So it's the center of the body. It offers protection and support, and muscles attached to it as well. So think about, see how it includes the skull, the vertebrae, the ribs, and the whole spine, basically, down to the sacrum even and coccyx. So this is the center of the body. It provides support so the body can stand up straight. Provides protection, like how the skull would protect the brain, or the ribs would protect the internal organs like the lungs and the heart. So its main job is support and protection. Where meanwhile, we have the appendicular skeleton, which on this image is colored pink or reddish color. Okay, and so this is the limbs. It includes the pectoral girdle, which is the arm limb, and how it attaches. So the shoulder blade and the collarbone, also known as the scapula and the clavicle. Okay, and it also includes the pelvic girdle, which means the leg limb and the pelvis where it attaches. So you can see that where this is colored in pink, their main job, the arms and the legs, is for movement, where the axial skeleton in the middle, its main job is for support and protection. Okay, so at this point, I want you to label your skeleton. So the one on that page, you are actually going to label which is axial and which is appendicular. So you might need to pause the video, but in the end, your finished color-coded skeleton will look something along the lines of this, where you have axial in one color, appendicular in the other. And if you did not write down the descriptions from the previous slides, go ahead and rewind the video so you can write in the major function of the axial skeleton and the major function of the appendicular skeleton. Okay? So while you're doing that, go ahead and pause the video. And this is something that needs to be complete on Wednesday. If it's not completed already, go ahead and do it now. And in a moment, we'll check our skull picture. Okay? Okay, so if you are finished with your axial and appendicular skeleton labeling, it's time to check the skull. If you need more time, pause the video before you get here. Okay, so for the skull, you should be aware and able to label these different images or different parts of the skull on any of these 3 views. Get the camera working. Okay, so for these bones, you have the frontal bone, which is like the frontal plate, which forms the forehead. You have temporal, which is not colored in here, but it's the side of the head. You have nasal, which is like the bridge of the nose, and the nasal septum, which is a bone inside the nasal cavity, inside the nose. It separates the two nostrils, basically. So you can only see the nasal septum by looking at the front of the skull. Okay, we have the maxilla, which is colored in orange here. That is this large bone that covers, a good portion of the face and above the top teeth. And zygomatic bone, I want you to think of that as the cheek. So the cheekbone is the zygomatic bone. So you could even write in parentheses here, cheekbone. Okay, and then the mandible is the jawbone. Orbit as well just means kind of the eye socket, the area where the eye would be found. Okay, now on this front view of the skull, one of the more confusing things to label for some people is this bone called the sphenoid. So the sphenoid bone is what you can see if you're looking through the open eye socket with no eye. You will see the bone in the back of it. Okay, so let's see if we can look at our real model of the skull right here. Okay, so this real or 3D model, you can see the zygomatic bone would be the bone in this region. Okay, so in the back of the eye socket. Did I say zygomatic? I mean the sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone would be in the back of the region right here. Okay, so if I look in the eye socket, in the orbit, I can see the sphenoid. But if you turn the actual skull on its side, I could also see the sphenoid bone like right in this area too. It's the same bone that you can see by looking through where the eye is. That's this bone right here. So you will see it labeled on the side of the skull as well. Okay, I also want to take this opportunity to show you the zygomatic bone. So you have the cheekbones, what we think of as the cheekbones in our face, right? But it goes around all the way to the side of the head, kind of near the ear. So I'm going to put this pen under, and you can see how it's its own bone that's kind of raised up. That's our cheekbone, also known as zygomatic. Okay, so moving on to the next picture is this one. Okay, so we have these four crossed off. Those are details we will not learn. Occipital bone is the back of the head. And if you labeled H as occipital, that would work as well. Either one of these, you just need to know this is occipital. Okay, we have parietal plate, which is red. Frontal, which is yellow. Temporal, you could think is kind of near where your temples are. It's the side of the head. And here's that sphenoid bone we were talking about before that you can see by looking into the eye. Okay, we have zygomatic, the cheek that we saw, maxilla, mandible, nasal, the bridge of the nose. There's two things we're going to add here though. Okay, first thing is notice that I labeled some sutures. These squiggly lines right here, right here, right here, those are areas where these different plates of the skull have fused together. Sutures are areas where they are joined, where they weren't joined before, like when we were newborns. So it's a dividing line between like the frontal plate and the parietal plate, but we can still see on the skull these kind of areas where they're joining together. Those are called sutures. If you look them up online, each suture has its own specific name. We're just learning that they are sutures, so you don't need to memorize the name of each different suture. Okay? And then there's one more thing to notice, that we have the lacrimal gland. This is near the bridge of your nose, also near your eye socket, kind of near your tear glands. It's the lacrimal bone. If I said lacrimal gland before accidentally, that's because we do have a lacrimal gland that makes tears. It's very close to this lacrimal bone that's kind of near the bridge of our nose, near our eye. That's where tears are made. So we have this bone right here that you can see called the lacrimal. Okay, final one would be the top of the head. So if we say anterior, then we know that's the front, right? The front of the head. So this side would be the side with the forehead. If we say posterior, we know that's the back. So that's the back of the head. Okay, and so just looking at what we had before from our picture up above, we know we have the frontal plate in the front. Parietal, this whole region, it's on both the left and the right side of the brain. or the brain, the skull, and then occipital in the very back of the skull. And again, we can see sutures right here, down the middle, and right here. That's where these plates have fused together. Okay, so that's the big idea for what you should have gotten from the skull labeling today. Please bring those to class on Wednesday because we'll be using them, and make sure you've answered the final question for our Ed puzzle and you're done with homework. Have a good rest of your evening.